The fluorescent lights of Blackwood Rehabilitation Center buzzed softly as Sophia Whitmore walked briskly down the sterile white hallway. The sharp scent of antiseptic and freshly waxed floors filled the air, mingling with the faint metallic tang of medical equipment. It was her third month at Blackwood, and the routine of caring for patients who rarely showed signs of improvement was beginning to dull the edge of her once fervent optimism, but nothing could have prepared her for room 417. She paused in front of the door, her fingers curling around the cold metal handle. Nathan Blake, the 38-year-old billionaire CEO who had once graced business magazines and dominated headlines, lay within. A man who had commanded boardrooms, who had been photographed at charity galas in perfectly tailored suits, and whose name had become synonymous with power and success. That same man was now reduced to a shell, imprisoned in his own body after a car accident 6 months prior left him in a persistent vegetative state. Sophia in Blake deeply before entering, mentally preparing herself. She had written about Nathan Blake before taking this assignment, not because she was awed by his wealth, but because she believed understanding a patient's life gave her a better chance at helping them. His family had long since disappeared, leaving his care in the hands of lawyers and cold professionals. She pushed the door open, the hinges groaning softly. Nathan lay motionless on the adjustable bed, his dark hair tousled and dull, a far cry from the slick, confident look she had seen in old photos. His eyes, though open, stared blankly at the ceiling. The machines that monitored his vitals beeped in rhythmic intervals, their cold precision a stark contrast to the man he had once been. Sophia sighed softly, approaching the bed. "Good morning, Mr. Blake," she said out of habit, her voice gentle and warm, even if she doubted he could hear her. Another beautiful day outside. The window blinds were partially open, letting streaks of golden morning light stripe the walls. She adjusted his pillow, careful with the tubing, then began her routine, checking his vitals, repositioning his limbs to prevent bed sores, and making sure his feeding tube was properly in place. It was mundane, clinical work, yet she handled it with unwavering care. As she worked, she found herself talking to him. Perhaps it was for her own sanity. "I read an article about you once," she said, her fingers brushing his cold hand as she adjusted an IV line, "about how you turned your first company into a billion-dollar empire by the time you were 30. I wonder if you ever got tired of it all, the board meetings, the power plays, or maybe you loved it." She paused, looking at his vacant eyes. "I hope you loved it." Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of the one-sided conversation. It was a text from Dr. Kapoor, the neurologist in charge of Nathan's case. "Routine scans scheduled for next week. No expected changes. No expected changes." The phrase echoed in her mind like a cruel mantra. She sighed and put the phone away. There was always a flicker of hope in her heart, that maybe, just maybe, today would be different. But hope, she had learned, was a dangerous thing in this line of work. It could gnaw at you, drain you dry. She was about to leave when she noticed something. A small change in the air, a shift she couldn't quite define. The room felt off. Eleanor frowned. She turned back to Nathan, her eyes narrowing as she studied his face. His eyes were the same vacant orbs, his expression unchanged. The machines beeped steadily, unbothered. She leaned in closer, searching for anything. A twitch, a flicker, a sign that her mind wasn't playing tricks on her. Nothing. She shook her head, brushing away the unease. Lack of sleep, she reasoned. Too many late-night shifts. Too many hopeless cases. But as she straightened up, the fine hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The door creaked open behind her. Startled, she spun around. It was Gregg, one of the older nurses, his mustache twitching as he gave her a tired smile. "Hey, Eleanor, just came to tell you your shift's over. Go home. Get some rest." She nodded, offering a weak smile. "Thanks, Gregg. Just finishing up." With a final glance at Nathan, she gathered her things and left, the door clicking shut behind her. That night, sleep evaded her. The sensation she had felt in Nathan's room gnawed at her, vague and inexplicable. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, pale and still. But there was something different in her memory now, something almost alive. The thought chilled her. The next morning, Eleanor returned to Blackwood with a gnawing sense of dread in her stomach. As she made her way through the corridors, Nodding at the other nurses and doctors, she found herself slowing down as she approached room 417. Her hand hovered over the door handle. "Get a grip, Eleanor." Pushing the door open, she stepped inside and froze. Nathan's head was turned. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. The angle of his jaw, the shift of his gaze. He was no longer staring blankly at the ceiling. His eyes were directed toward the window, where the sunlight poured in through the blinds. Her breath caught in her throat. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, convinced it was an illusion. But no, his eyes remained fixed on the window. They didn't move, didn't blink, but they were different. She stepped closer, her heart hammering. "Mr. Blake," she whispered, her voice barely audible. No response. Of course not. He was in a vegetative state. He couldn't possibly. Then she saw it. A tear. A single tear rolled down his cheek, glistening in the sunlight before disappearing into the stubble on his jaw. Eleanor's blood ran cold. The monitors didn't change, didn't reflect any shift in his vitals. But she saw it. A tear, unmistakably real, trailing down his motionless face. She backed away, her hand covering her mouth, her mind racing with panic and disbelief. Was she losing it? Was her mind cracking under the pressure of this job? She stumbled out of the room, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Greg was at the nurse's station, scribbling notes in a file. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, looking up. She couldn't find her voice. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear, but before she could gather her thoughts, a muffled thud came from room 417. Eleanor's heart seized. She turned slowly, her gaze fixed on the door she had just exited. The sound was soft, almost as if something or someone had moved inside. She stared at Greg, her voice trembling. "Did you hear that?" He frowned. "Hear what?" Another thud, louder this time. Eleanor's knees went weak. She took a step back, the sterile hallway feeling suddenly claustrophobic. Something's happening in there. Greg rose to his feet, his brow furrowed. He walked toward the door, his hand reaching for the handle. But before he could open it, a sound drifted out from inside the room, a sound that shouldn't have been possible, a deep, guttural whisper. Eleanor's legs felt rooted to the cold tile floor, her breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat. The whisper that drifted from inside room 417 had been unmistakably human, raw, faint and chilling, but that couldn't be. Nathan Blake had been declared in a persistent vegetative state. No brain activity, no ability to communicate, nothing. She gripped Greg's arm, her fingers trembling. "Greg, did you hear that?" He shook his head, concern etched on his lined face. "Hear what?" "Eleanor, you need to take a breath." But she couldn't. The sound still echoed in her ears, threading icy tendrils of dread through her chest. Her mind wrestled with logic, but every fiber of her being screamed that something was terribly wrong. "Please," she managed, her voice shaking. "Please go inside with me." Greg hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "Eleanor, you've been working double shifts. Maybe you're just exhausted. I've seen it happen before." "I know what I heard," she insisted, her voice steadier now, though her hands still shook. "Please, Greg." He sighed, nodded reluctantly, and pushed open the door. The room was exactly as she'd left it. The machines beeped steadily. The sunlight slanted across the floor. Nathan Blake lay motionless in his bed, his eyes still fixed toward the window, expression vacant. Greg glanced at her, his face softening. "See? There's nothing." A sudden gasp escaped Nathan's lips, a deep rattling inhalation that reverberated through the room. Eleanor's heart stopped. Greg's face went pale, his mouth opening and closing, like a fish gasping for air. "What the?" Nathan's fingers twitched. It was small, the tiniest flicker of movement, but undeniable. The machines remained unchanged. The monitors beeped steadily, showing no spike in heart rate, no fluctuation in brain activity. But Eleanor couldn't tear her eyes away from his hand. It had moved. Greg stumbled backward, his voice hoarse. "I'll get Dr. Kapoor." He bolted from the room, leaving Eleanor alone with Nathan. She took a cautious step closer, her pulse pounding in her ears. Mr. Blake, her voice was barely a whisper. Can you hear me? His eyes remained fixed on the window. His chest rose and fell in the same mechanical rhythm. She reached out, hesitating before gently taking his hand in hers. It was cold, unresponsive, but then she felt it. A slight pressure, barely there like the memory of a touch. She jerked her hand back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The door swung open and Dr. Kapoor rushed in, Greg close behind. The doctor's face was a mask of practiced calm, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. What happened? Dr. Kapoor asked, his gaze moving between Eleanor and Nathan. Greg said you witnessed some kind of movement. Eleanor swallowed hard. He gasped and his fingers twitched. I felt him squeeze my hand. Dr. Kapoor's eyes narrowed, skepticism clouding his expression. There's no way he could have done that. His latest scans showed no signs of cognitive function. I know what I saw, Eleanor insisted. Dr. Kapoor walked to Nathan's bedside, leaning in to examine his eyes. He checked the monitors, the tubing, everything. Vitals are normal, no sign of distress or change in brain activity. He straightened up, his voice firm. I'll order another MRI, but, Eleanor, it's possible you're experiencing pareidolia, your mind perceiving patterns where there are none. Her face burned. I'm not imagining things. Dr. Kapoor sighed, his tone softening. You care deeply for your patients. Sometimes that can blur the line between reality and hope. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to nod. Arguing wouldn't help, I understand. But inside, her mind roared in defiance. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. Her colleagues' footsteps echoed around her, conversations drifting past as white noise. She went through the motions, checking patients, administering medications, but her thoughts remained trapped in room 417. By the time her shift ended, the sky had darkened to a dusky purple. She lingered by the staff locker room, debating whether to go home or check on Nathan one last time. Just one more look. Her feet carried her back to room 417 before she realized she'd made the decision. The hallway was quiet, the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound. She cracked the door open and slipped inside. The room was bathed in shadows, the blinds half closed. Nathan lay still, his face illuminated by a thin strip of moonlight. Eleanor blinked slowly. Maybe Dr. Kapoor was right. Maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on her mind. She approached his bed, brushing her fingers over his forearm, the fabric of his hospital gown smooth and cool beneath her touch. Good night, Mr. Blake, she whispered. She turned to leave, her fingers grazing the door handle, and then she heard it. Don't go. The voice was raspy, barely a whisper, but it froze her in place. She spun around, her heart slamming against her ribs. Nathan's eyes were locked onto hers. They weren't vacant now. They were alive, dark and intense, filled with something she couldn't decipher. Her knees buckled and she gripped the wall for support. Mr. Blake? Her voice trembled. His lips parted again, the effort seeming monumental. Help! Mr. A. Cold shiver traced its way down her spine. This wasn't possible. His vitals, his brain scans, they all said he couldn't communicate, couldn't be aware. But here he was, looking at her with desperation, etched into every feature. She stumbled forward, her instincts warring with disbelief. I don't understand. What's happening to you? His eyelids fluttered, sweat beading on his brow. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Panic flashed across his face. It's okay, she said, her voice shaking. Take your time. I'm here. He closed his eyes, his breathing ragged. When he opened them again, a tear slid down his cheek. Trapped, he whispered. Can't move. Her mind raced. How was this happening? Was it possible he was experiencing locked-in syndrome, a condition where a person is fully conscious but unable to move or communicate except through blinking or tiny movements? But his tests hadn't shown signs of this. The doctors would have caught it, wouldn't they? She squeezed his hand, her resolve hardening. I'll get help. I'll tell Dr. Kapoor. Nathan's eyes widened in fear. No, the word was a strangled croak. Don't trust them, her breath caught. What do you mean? Footsteps echoed from the hallway. Someone was coming. Nathan's eyes darted to the door, panic overtaking his features. "Please," he gasped, "pretend." The door swung open and Dr. Kapoor stepped in, his eyes narrowing. "Sophia, what are you doing here?" She straightened, forcing calm into her voice. "Just checking his vitals one last time." Dr. Kapoor's gaze swept over Nathan, then settled back on her. "You should go home, get some rest." She hesitated, then nodded. "You're right." She walked past him, her heart thundering in her chest. As she stepped into the hallway, she glanced back. Dr. Kapoor stood by Nathan's bed, his expression unreadable. She turned the corner and pressed her back against the wall, sucking in a shaky breath. Nathan's words echoed in her mind. Don't trust them. What did he mean? Who couldn't she trust? The sterile walls of Blackwood Rehabilitation suddenly felt oppressive, like they were closing in on her. She'd taken this job to help people, to make a difference, but now it felt like she'd stepped into something much darker, much more sinister. And whatever it was, Nathan Blake was at the center of it, her fingers curled into fists. She couldn't ignore this. Nathan was alive in there, trapped and terrified, and if he didn't trust the people in charge of his care, then neither could she. But how far was she willing to go to uncover the truth? The night was an icy black sheet, stretching endlessly over the Blackwood Rehabilitation Center. Eleanor sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The quiet of the night pressed against her, a stark contrast to the storm of anxiety inside her mind. Nathan's desperate plea echoed in her ears. Don't trust them. She'd replayed his words 100 times, each repetition chiseling away at her confidence. Was she going mad? Was exhaustion twisting her perception? But his eyes, those alive, terrified eyes, had been undeniable. He wasn't in a vegetative state. He was trapped, aware, and begging for help. A sharp knock on her window jolted her out of her thoughts. She gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. Through the fogged glass, she saw Greg, his face lined with concern. She rolled the window down, her breath misting in the cold air. "Greg, you scared me. Sorry, kid." He stuffed his hands in his pockets, glancing around as if making sure no one else was near. "You've been sitting here for over an hour. What's going on?" She hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing against her ribs. "Greg," she swallowed. "Something's wrong with Nathan Blake. He's not in a vegetative state. He spoke to me. He moved." Greg's eyes widened. For a moment his face was a mask of disbelief, but then his brow furrowed. "Are you sure?" "Eleanor, that kind of thing doesn't just happen. I know what I saw," she insisted, "and what I heard. He told me not to trust them. I think," she glanced around, her voice dropping to a whisper, "I think something's being covered up." Greg's jaw tightened. He looked down the empty parking lot, his eyes shadowed. "You need to be careful with accusations like that. If the administration hears you're stirring things up," she sighed. "I don't care about the consequences, Greg. Nathan needs help." He rubbed his face, exhaling slowly. Okay, listen. Let me check something. There might be old records or notes in the archives that we missed. Maybe we can figure out what's going on." Relief washed over her. "Thank you." "Go home, get some rest," he said, his voice low. "I'll call you if I find anything." She nodded, though the idea of sleep felt impossible. Her mind buzzed with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. As Greg walked back into the building, she started her engine, the low rumble filling the silence. She pulled out of the parking lot, her eyes lingering on the darkened windows of room 417. Hang on, Nathan. Sleep never came. Instead, she spent hours scouring the internet for any information on Nathan's accident. Most articles were rehashes of the same facts. Nathan Blake's car had skidded off the road during a rainstorm. He'd suffered a severe head injury, leaving him in a vegetative state. No suspicion of foul play, no irregularities, but something nagged at her. It was too clean, too simple. At 4 a.m., her phone buzzed, shattering the silence. She snatched it up, her heart leaping. "Greg," she answered, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you find something?" "I did." His voice trembled. "You need to get back here." Now the line went dead. The drive to Blackwood was a blur, her hands clammy on the wheel. The facility was eerily quiet, the early morning air biting at her cheeks as she rushed to the staff entrance. The door was ajar, swinging gently in the wind. Her gut clenched. Something was wrong. She stepped inside, the hallway lights flickering overhead. "Greg," she called softly, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. Her footsteps echoed as she made her way to the records room. The door was cracked open, a thin sliver of light spilling out. She pushed it wider and froze. Papers were strewn across the floor, file cabinets yanked open, their contents scattered. The room looked ransacked. Her eyes darted around until they landed on a figure slumped against the wall. "Greg." A strangled cry escaped her lips. She rushed to his side, dropping to her knees. His eyes fluttered open, pain etched across his face. "Greg, what happened?" He coughed, blood staining his lips. "They... number. They know we're onto them." Terror gripped her. Who did this? His hand trembled as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a flash drive. He pressed it into her palm, his fingers cradled. "Take it. Everything's on there. Records, notes, things they didn't want anyone to see." Her breath hitched. "I'm calling for help." He shook his head, his grip on her hand tightening. "No time. They're coming." A sound echoed from down the hall, the unmistakable click of dress shoes on tile. Her blood turned to ice. Greg's eyes were desperate. "Go." Tears streamed down her face as she squeezed his hand one last time. Then she rose. The flash drive clutched in her palm and slipped out of the room. The hallway stretched before her, empty and endless. She crept forward. Every muscle in her body coiled tight. She could hear voices behind her, low and angry. "Check the records room." She ducked into a supply closet just as the beam of a flashlight swept past. Her heart hammered so loudly she was sure they'd hear it. The footsteps paused, then moved on. She waited, barely daring to breathe. After what felt like an eternity, the hallway fell silent again. She slipped out, her shoes whispering against the floor as she made her way to Nathan's room. She had no plan, only the burning need to get to him. He was at the center of this, and whatever Greg had found there, Nathan knew the truth. She pushed open the door to room 417 and rushed to his bedside. His eyes snapped to hers, panic and relief flashing across his face. "I'm getting you out of here," she whispered, her voice fierce. His lips parted, and for the first time a hint of a smile touched his mouth. It was faint, fragile, but real. She grabbed his medical chart, scanning for anything she could use. Then she saw it, a note tucked into the back of the file, almost hidden. Experimental treatment approved by Dr. Kapoor. Authorized sedation levels increased, monitoring unnecessary. Her breath caught. They'd been drugging him, keeping him in this state. But why? What were they hiding? A noise behind her made her whirl around. Dr. Kapoor stood in the doorway, his eyes cold. "I was hoping you'd let this go, Sophia." Her body went numb. "You did this," he sighed as if disappointed. "Nathan knows things he shouldn't, things that could ruin powerful people. We couldn't let that happen." Her jaw clenched. "You're going to let him die to protect a secret." Dr. Kapoor's face darkened. "It's not a secret. It's about what needs to be done." Before he could step closer, she grabbed a syringe from the tray beside Nathan's bed. "Don't come any closer." Dr. Kapoor hesitated, his eyes flicking to the needle. "You won't do it," she swallowed, fear and fury twisting inside her. "Try me," Nathan's voice rasped beside her. "Sophia, run." "No," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm not leaving you." Dr. Kapoor took a step forward. Nathan's hand twitched, his fingers brushing hers. The faintest whisper of strength, and in that moment she knew they would fight together. Time slowed as Sophia locked eyes with Dr. Kapoor. The needle trembled in her grip, adrenaline buzzing through her veins. The sterile walls of room 4117 seemed to close in, the air so thick it was suffocating. Nathan's fingers twitched again against hers, his eyes filled with a desperate, silent plea. He couldn't speak now, but she could hear him loud and clear. "Don't let him win." Dr. Kapoor took another step forward, his expression cold and calculating. "Sophia, let's not make this worse. You're not thinking clearly." Oh, I'm thinking more clearly than I ever have, she shot back, her voice steady despite the storm of fear inside her. You've been drugging him, keeping him in this state to protect some dirty secret. I know what you've done, Doctor. Kapoor's jaw tightened, a vein pulsing at his temple. You think you can save him. Even if you manage to get out of this room, where will you go? Everyone here answers to me. The police. They're already on my side. The truth of his words sliced through her, but she couldn't let the fear take over. Not now. Maybe they are, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I don't need everyone. I just need someone, and I have the evidence. She clutched the flash drive tighter in her free hand. Dr. Kapoor's eyes flicked to the drive, his composure slipping. Hand it over now. Number. He lunged forward. Before she could think, she plunged the needle into his arm, pressing the plunger down. He jerked back, eyes widening in shock. He stared at the syringe, then at her, disbelief etched across his face. What? What did you do? He slurred, his knees buckling. Just a sedative, she said coldly. Enjoy your nap. He crumpled to the floor, his body going limp. The room fell into an eerie silence, the only sound the rhythmic beeping of Nathan's monitors. Eleanor's breath came in ragged gasps as she stared at Dr. Kapoor's unconscious form. Her hands were shaking, but she didn't have time to process what she'd just done. She turned to Nathan, his eyes wide with shock and hope. We have to get out of here, she whispered. His lips moved, barely forming the word. How? She scanned the room, her mind racing. She couldn't carry him on her own. His muscles were weak from months of immobility, but she spotted a wheelchair by the corner of the room, folded and forgotten. Rushing over, she yanked it open, the metal creaking softly. She positioned it next to the bed and took a deep breath. Nathan, this is going to hurt, but I need you to help me as much as you can. He blinked slowly, his way of saying, okay. She wrapped her arms under his shoulders, using every ounce of strength to lift him. His body was heavier than she'd anticipated, his limbs awkward and limp. He groaned, his face contorted in pain, but he didn't give up. Bit by bit, she managed to ease him into the wheelchair, sweat dripping down her back by the time he was seated. She adjusted his legs, making sure he was secure. We're almost there. His fingers brushed her wrist, a faint touch of reassurance. She cracked the door open, peering into the hallway. The lights were dimmed for the night shift, shadows pooling in the corners. The security station at the end of the hall was empty, thank God. She pushed the wheelchair out of the room, her heart pounding with every step. Each creak of the wheels sounded like a gunshot in the silence. She half expected alarms to blare, guards to appear around every corner, but the corridor remained empty. They reached the elevator. She jabbed the button, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds. The doors slid open with a soft chime, and she hurried Nathan inside, her hands shaking as she pressed the button for the ground floor. The doors closed. Eleanor sagged against the wall, her chest heaving. Nathan's eyes were locked on her, dark with gratitude and something deeper, a trust so raw it nearly undid her. You're doing great, she whispered, reaching out to brush a lock of hair from his forehead. His skin was warm now, life pulsing just beneath the surface. The elevator doors opened to the lobby. It was quiet, the night receptionist dozing behind the desk, unaware. Eleanor pushed the wheelchair forward, every nerve on high alert. Almost there. They passed through the automatic doors and into the biting night air. The parking lot was a vast stretch of darkness, her car parked near the edge. Relief flooded her veins. We made it, she breathed, but as she unlocked the car, a voice cut through the night. Stop right there. Her stomach turned to ice. She spun around to see two security guards racing toward them, their faces grim. Nathan's fingers clenched the armrest, his eyes blazing with frustration and fear. Get in, she shouted. She shoved him toward the passenger seat, adrenaline lending her strength. The guards were closing in, their footsteps pounding against the pavement. She got Nathan into the car, his body slumping into the seat. She sprinted around to the driver's side, her breath ragged. Just as she slammed the door shut, one of the guards reached the car, banging on the window. She turned the key. The engine roared to life. The guard yelled something, his face twisted in anger. But she didn't hear him. Her mind was a white-hot streak of desperation. She floored the accelerator. The car peeled out of the lot, tires screeching. The guard's figure shrank in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the darkness. Eleanor's hands trembled on the wheel as they sped down the empty road. The wind whipped through the open window, cold and sharp against her face. She glanced at Nathan. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. "We're safe," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if it was true. "We're safe now." They drove for hours, the city lights fading behind them. As dawn broke, she pulled into a secluded rest area off the highway. The sky was painted in soft hues of orange and pink, the world holding its breath. Eleanor turned off the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. Nathan's eyes fluttered open. Exhaustion and pain etched into his features. But beneath it, there was something else. Hope. She reached for his hand, her fingers brushing his knuckles. "We'll figure this out. Together." A tear slid down his cheek, and this time it wasn't one of pain. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "for believing in me." Her chest tightened, warmth spreading through her. "I couldn't leave you there." He squeezed her hand, his grip stronger than before. "You saved my life, Eleanor. And you've changed mine," she admitted softly. For a moment they simply looked at each other. The world outside faded away, leaving just the two of them, bound by shared fear, hope, and something fragile but unmistakably real. Then Nathan smiled, a real smile, one that reached his eyes. And despite everything, she found herself smiling back. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The story of Sophia Whitmore and Nathan Blake is more than just a tale of survival. It's a testament to the power of trust and courage. Sophia's unwavering determination and bravery helped her confront fear and uncover the truth, ultimately saving Nathan from a cruel conspiracy. This story reminds us that standing up for what is right, even in the face of danger, defines our character and values. It also shows how compassion and humanity can transform the fate of those who seem lost. What do you think about this story? Did Sophia's courage and Nathan's resilience inspire you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit like to support us and subscribe to our channel for more meaningful stories. Thank you for watching.